Because he saw both how funny and how hard it was, she liked him. It would have been quite different had he seen either one without the other. "You can tell me how not to infringe the copyright?" she laughed. "I'm not sure that I know what a copyright is." He laughed, a laugh which belonged with his voice. "Mr. Littletree isn't as lucid as he thinks he is. I've been here a week or so, and picked up a few things you might like to know." He pulled his chair closer to her table then, and gave her a lesson in the making of copy. Edna Willard was never one half so attractive as when absorbed in a thing which someone was showing her how to do. Her hazel eyes would widen and glisten with the joy of comprehending. Her cheeks would flush a deeper pink with the coming of new light. Her mouth would part in a childlike way it had forgotten to outgrow. Her head would nod gleefully in token that she understood, and she had a way of pulling at her wavy hair and making it more wavy than it had been before. The man at the next table was a long time in explaining the making of a dictionary. He spoke in low tones, often looking at the figure of the man in the skull-cap, who was sitting with his back to them, looking over copy. Once she cried excitedly, "Oh, I see!" And he warned, "Shh," explaining, "Let him think you got it all from him. It will give you a better stand-in." She nodded appreciatively, and felt very well acquainted with this kind man whose voice made her think of something, called to something, she did not just know what. After that, she became so absorbed in lexicography that when the men began putting away their things it was hard to realize that the morning had gone. It was a new and difficult game, the evasion of the copyright furnishing the stimulus of a hazard. The man at the next table had been watching her with an amused admiration. Her childlike absorption, the way every emotion from perplexity to satisfaction expressed itself in the poise of her head and the pucker of her face, took him back over years emotionally barren, to the time when he too had those easily stirred enthusiasms of youth. For the man at the next table was far from young now. His mouth had never quite parted with boyishness, but there was more white than black in his hair, and the lines about his mouth told that time, as well as forces more aging than time, had laid heavy hand upon him. But when he looked at the girl and told her with a smile that it was time to stop work, it was a smile and a voice to defy the most telltale face in all the world. During her luncheon, as she watched the strange people coming and going, she did much wondering. She wondered why it was that so many of the men at the dictionary place were very old men. She wondered if it would be a good dictionary, one that would be used in the schools. She wondered if Dr. Bunting had made a great deal of money. And most of all, she wondered about the man at the next table, whose voice was like a dream which she did not know that she had dreamed. When she had returned to the straggling old building, had stumbled down the narrow, dark hall, and opened the door of the big bleak room, she saw that the man at the next table was the only one who had returned from luncheon. Something in his profile made her stand there very still. He had not heard her come in, and he was looking straight ahead, eyes half closed, mouth set, no unsurrendered boyishness there now. Wholly unconsciously she took an impulsive step forward. But she stopped, for she saw and felt without really understanding that it was not just the moment's pain, but the revealed pain of years. Just then he began to cough, and it seemed the cough, too, was more than of the moment. And then he turned and saw her and smiled, and the smile changed all. As the afternoon wore on, the man stopped working, and turning a little in his chair sat there covertly watching the girl. She was just typically girl. It was written that she had spent her days in the happy ways of healthful girlhood. He supposed that a great many young fellows had fallen in love with her, nice, clean young fellows, the kind she would naturally meet. and then his eyes closed for a minute, and he put up his hand and brushed back his hair. There was weariness weary of itself in the gesture. He looked about the room and scanned the faces of the men, most of them older than he, many of them men whose histories were well known to him. They were the usual hangers-on about newspaper offices, men who, for one reason or another, age, dissipation, antiquated methods, had been pitched over. Men for whom such work as this came as a godsend. They were the men of yesterday, men whom the world had rushed past. She was the only one there, this girl who would probably sit here beside him for many months, with whom the future had anything to do. Youth, goodness, joy, hope, strange things to bring to a place like this. And as if their alienism disturbed him, he moved restlessly, almost resentfully, bit his lips nervously, moistened them, and began putting away his things. As the girl was starting home along Dearborn Street a few minutes later, she chanced to look in a window. She saw that it was a saloon, but before she could turn away, she saw a man with a white face, white with the peculiar whiteness of a dark face, standing before the bar, drinking from a small glass. She stood still, arrested by a look such as she had never seen before. A panting human soul sobbingly fluttering down into something from which it had spent all its force in trying to rise. When she recalled herself and passed on, a mist which she could neither account for nor banish was dimming the clear hazel of her eyes. The next day was a hard one at the dictionary place. She told herself it was because the novelty of it was wearing away, because her fingers ached, because it tired her back to sit in that horrid chair. She did not admit of any connection between her flagging interest and the fact that the place at the next table was vacant. The following day he was still absent. She assumed that it was nervousness occasioned by her queer surroundings made her look around whenever she heard a step behind her. Where was he? Where had that look carried him? If he were in trouble, was there no one to help him? The third day she did an unpremeditated thing. The man in the skull cap had been showing her something about the copy. As he was leaving, she asked, "Is the man who sits at the next table coming back?" "Oh, yes," he replied grimly. "He'll be back." "Because," she went on, "if he wasn't, I thought I would take his shears. These hurt my fingers." He made the exchange for her, and after that things went better. He did return late the next morning. After he had taken his place, he looked over at her and smiled. He looked sick and shaken, as if something that knew no mercy had taken hold of him and wrung body and soul. "You have been ill?" she asked, with timid solicitude. "Oh, no," he replied, rather shortly. He was quiet all that day, but the next day they talked about the work, laughed together over funny definitions they found. She felt that he could tell many interesting things about himself, if he cared to. As the days went on he did tell some of those things. Out-of-the-way places where he had worked, queer people whom he had known. It seemed that words came to him as gifts, came freely, happily, pleased perhaps to be borne by so sympathetic a voice. And there was another thing about him. He always seemed to know just what she was trying to say. He never missed the unexpressed. That made it easy to say things to him. There seemed a certain at-homeness between his thought and hers. She accounted for her interest in him by telling herself she had never known anyone like that before. Now Harold, the boy whom she knew best out at the university, why, one had to say things to Harold to make him understand. And Harold never left one wondering what he had meant by that smile, what he had been going to say when he started to say something